Okay, last time we talked about the book of Revelation, and I ended up by saying, trying to place Revelation in the context of Roman politics and the imperial cult. Clearly, this author, whoever wrote Revelation, and it is somebody named John, although as we said, it's not the same John who wrote the Gospels or wrote the letters. It's not John, son of Zebedee. It's just some other guy named John. John was a very common name for Jews in the first century, so it's not uncommon that we have a guy named John but don't know exactly who he is in relation to anybody else in early Christianity. One of the things that I ended was by saying, let's imagine his politics. This is clearly an anti-Roman document. That's the one thing we can say about it for sure. Who would write this, and why would he write it to these seven letters to these seven churches that we have in Revelation? One way to think about this is, if this document was written toward the last part of the first century, as a lot of scholars think it is, this may be, and I said, remember, his Greek is bad. He doesn't write Greek well. Sometimes it's even grammatically wrong in places. It's just not bad Greek, even though we don't have really good Greek in most of the New Testament, but this is the worst. How do you think of someone who is against eating meat sacrificed to idols, seems to think of himself as a true Jew, and the Jews who are occupying synagogues in different parts of Asia Minor as not true Jews, anti-women as far as their roles in the churches? There's nothing we know about this woman he calls Jezebel, except that he's using this nickname from the Old Testament for a whore-like, idolatrous woman, Jezebel, and labeling some Christian woman who's a leader in one of these churches. He's labeling her with this terrible term. And I suggested maybe he's actually writing against the kind of Christianity we see represented by Paul's churches, which were right there in these places, such as Ephesus and Smyrna that he's writing to. Because Paul's churches actually have people in them who are fairly well off in some cases. They seem to be fairly comfortable with Roman culture. They may have their own businesses. They have their own slaves. There are women leaders in Paul's churches. Paul allows that sort of thing, as some of you have pointed out in your papers on that. And they believe it's okay to eat meat sacrificed to idols, which this author seems to think is idolatrous in itself. So I suggested that maybe this guy is writing Revelation precisely to attack the kind of Christianity we see represented in Paul's own letters. What kind of person might this be? One way is just to imagine, and this is pure speculation, pure imagination. What if this guy had come from Palestine himself? Maybe he lived through the Jewish War of 70. Remember in 70 when the Temple of Jerusalem was destroyed and Jerusalem was overrun by the Romans? Thousands of Jews were taken up into slavery and taken to Rome and sold off to be slaves. And the land was devastated to a certain extent. Maybe he lived through that war, and that increased his hatred of the Romans. And he gets to Western Asia Minor. He's traveling around other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. He gets to Western Asia Minor, and here he doesn't see followers of Jesus who are, like him, poor, not very well educated perhaps, hateful of the Roman Empire, and see themselves as being oppressed by the Roman Empire. He sees Christians who think that they're followers of Jesus also, but they're fairly comfortable in their world. They live in a comfortable Greek and Greco-Roman urban environments. And so he writes Revelation to try to shake them up, to get them to hate Rome as much as he hates Rome, to get them to be just as wary of the imperial cult as he is. So that's one picture, definitely of early Christianity, that we see an anti-Roman kind of politics. The live question this week, and the question you'll be talking about in your discussion groups on Thursday and Friday, and some of you will be writing papers about, is what is the politics of early Christianity? In some of the old Hollywood-type days, the idea was that early Christianity was a movement of slaves or all completely poor people, and Rome was always going around persecuting early Christian groups, and there were these little bands of early Christians huddled in dining rooms somewhere, or huddled in the catacombs in Rome, or huddled in caves. Well, that's Hollywood. The Romans actually didn't pay that much attention to the early Christian groups at all until much later than this. There was no coherent persecution attempt by the Romans against the Jesus movement at any time until much later in history. So you don't have Rome taking even notice of most of these little house churches founded by Paul and other Christian missionaries.